And one more time, today we're going to be covering standards-based grading, looking at teacher perspectives as well as a peek into parent view and student view. So I'm just going to kind of hop right in. I'll get away from my PowerPoint here in a second, but we're going to be talking about standards-based grading as a teacher. So in May's webinar, we talked about what it looks like as an administrator, why we grade by standards. So I kind of kept that part in my PowerPoint for this topic as well, because that really hasn't changed. The idea with standards-based grading is that it allows us to take a closer look at how students are performing in individual areas instead of just giving a student an assignment, like an overall assignment score, which is going to be a traditional way of grading. I can see in my top example here, my student has a C in English class, but I don't know how she's performing in different areas, if she can read, if she can write, if she can, write expository papers, any of that kind of stuff. Like, I have no idea how she's performing. Whereas in my bottom screenshot, this is where standards-based grading comes in, and I can take a look and see that she's doing really well at that second standard here, produce clear and coherent writing, but she needs a little bit of help with that first standard, analyzing the impact of authors' choices. So it lets you take a deeper dive into a student's performance as far as that goes. Okay, so I'm going to be done with my PowerPoint from here, and we are going to hop into Synergy here. I'm going to sign out as my teacher. I'm actually going to go in as an administrator first, just to review some of the setup that we did before. All right, so in Synergy, I'm going to go to the standards screen. And if you're on version 2020, which is what this is, you're going to see some changes to the standard screen. We're not really going to talk about them right now, other than that this has become a smart selector so that you don't have to guess and choose. Really just memorize where you have your standards saved and sorted. This is a smart selector, so I know that I have second grade state standards in here, and the minute you choose it, it kind of updates down here. So that's really nice instead of having to guess. Anyway. So we come in here, we go into standard types. If you recall from May's webinar, this is going to be the grouping of standards in your system. So a lot of districts will keep them in by like subject areas. So you might have math standards, language arts standards, social studies standards, whatever, that's fine. Some districts will do it by grade level. So you might have high school standards, middle school standards, elementary standards, and some really are just like a hodgepodge. They might put every single standard that they have under Common Core, and that's fine. They might do them all under report card standards. So we can have those conversations of what best suits you for organizing your standards. We have a gradebook score type here that's used. This is going to be to score the standard. So in the past, your teachers would create assignments and they would, use like a raw score type or percentage score type. We tend to get away from those kinds of score types with standards-based grading because it's a proficiency-based grading. We want to see how proficient the student is, if they can do it on their own, if they need some help, if whatever. So we typically use something like a 4-point, 6, 8-point rubric that goes along with that, and this covers every standard within that type. So we talked about that last time. So in my example, I'm going to be using a 4-point rubric. We have this aggregation method. That's going to be if we assess a standard more than one time, we have to be able to calculate all those results together. So if I ask a student, can you count from 1 to 10? I might have them do it orally. I might have them do it on paper, do a project, sing a song, whatever. Anytime that I ask them can you count to 10, that's going to be considered an assessment, and now we need to combine those results. So if they do it, they can't really do it at the start of school, but a quarter in, they're really proficient. We need to be able to combine those scores. So we have a lot of different options here, ranging from like lowest score, so just choosing kind of the weakest assessment for that standard and giving them that, saying that's how proficient the student is, to something like Power Law, which is a trend-based analysis, which uses a crazy formula and determines if the student was assessed today, how would they perform, kind of a little prediction tool there. We have child aggregation method. We'll look at that a little bit later today. But that's going to be if we have standards that fall under other standards, how do we calculate like a parent standard score? So algebra might consist of fractions and polynomials or something. And we need to be able to combine these two similar ideas of fractions and polynomials into something like algebra. So kind of rolling up is the word that we'll use. And so that's going to be that child aggregation method. The district can choose to lock that method, so teachers can't change this. Probably a conversation that we want to have if you want to lock that or not. Personally, I like when districts kind of set this so that everybody kind of knows in the district that they're all kind of grading the same way, so that you don't have one math teacher whose standard scores are calculated using the lowest score, which is really difficult for a student, especially if they do poorly on one of them, and then you have another teacher who chooses highest score, which if a student kind of gets lucky and gets high proficiency, their grade's going to be better, so then the kids kind of know what teacher to get and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I tend to like to lock that. I'm not going to lock it now because we might be changing some things later. And then if we need to hide some standards in the future, we can choose to make them not visible. That's basically what we talked about on our first go-round in May, was talking about all these settings, getting standards into your system, and a lot of this is having conversations with us here at EduPoint to lead you in the right direction for transitioning to standards-based grading. From here, I'm going to bounce over to standard levels. These levels are going to be that parent-child tiered relationship among standards. So you might use words like domain, thread, standard, concept, cluster, all those kinds of things. And so we have a highest level standards that might be called domains, and you have your lowest standards that might be called like performance objectives or even standards themselves. And so this is where you define that list for your importing, however you're going to use those, and we'll see what that looks like in Gradebook when we start to analyze data. And then the last thing we talked about in May would have been importing standards and how to get those standards into your system. So we can do a straight up Excel file import for like custom standards, or we have a partner with Certica Academic Benchmark that most likely will have standards for the state that you need, but they're kind of managed by that company, so we don't manage any of those standards. All right, so now let's talk about what it looks like as a teacher, which is kind of the whole point of today. I'm going to go into my system as a secondary teacher. I'm avoiding elementary teachers for this webinar. It doesn't get so much more complicated with how teachers do things. There's one extra screen that the teachers use, but really the majority of that elementary setup is going to be on that standards-based report card and aligning standards to your existing rows of the report card. And that's the piece that I can't do during this webinar. So I'm going to avoid elementary teachers kind of altogether. All right, so if I'm a secondary teacher, I'm going to go ahead and come into my Gradebook main. And I'm going to focus to a class that I like. And the first thing that your teachers do at the beginning of the year is come into Gradebook Setup, and we need to enable standards mode. This isn't something that we can do at the district level as of yet. We're working on a solution for that in the future. But this is a class-by-class setting. So your teachers come into Gradebook Setup class settings. They edit the row for whatever classes they want, and you have the option of turning standards mode on and off. And if you are a secondary teacher, you have the option of where your overall grade in class comes from. So you might keep track of assignment scores, like the student got 17 out of 20 on a quiz, but maybe you want your overall grade to still come from the individual standards that were assessed. Or if you're doing some kind of hybrid grading or a pilot of standards-based grading, you might keep your overall grade coming from assignment. That would be like a traditional way of doing it, but you want to keep track of standards data. That's fine too. We can talk about that separately if you have questions about what's best for your district. In my case, I'm going to have standards mode on for all of my classes, and then my overall grade is going to be calculated from the standards. Okay, so when you turn standards mode on when you turn it on for your class, what that really does in Gradebook main, you're going to see a toggle up at the top of your Gradebook. So normally you access Gradebook, your teachers access Gradebook, and they're focused to the assignments view. We don't call it assignments view until we turn standards mode on, but now that it's here, you'll see both toggles here. That's what turning standards mode on does. It lets the teachers toggle between everything in assignments mode versus everything, and I'll bounce around here just a little bit, everything in standards mode. Okay, we'll avoid that. Okay, doing some Google testing earlier, and I wasn't quite done with it. All right, so that's going to be their first step, enabling standards mode and seeing the different toggle here. The next thing that the teachers can do is go into some other settings. So I'm going to go into Gradebook Setup, and I'm going to go into Standards here. Typically a tab that we give to teachers depending on the amount of flexibility that you allow your teachers in Gradebook. But we'll talk about the settings that are kind of here by default. The first one is going to be Standards Proficiency. So we talked about the calculation or aggregation method used or set at the district level, the mean, median, mode, power law, high score, low score, etc. If you choose to not lock that at the district level, the teachers can come in here and say that every standard that I use from here on out, so not anything that's already in my gradebook, but from right now moving forward, is going to be calculated using the highest score. So this is a setting that the teachers can kind of choose for themselves and calculate their grades based on that. If they leave it as district values, it's going to follow whatever the district has, and even if they set this and the district has it locked, we're going to follow the district locked ones. The next piece is going to be this final mark by standards. There's some rules that go along with this one, but basically our options are to calculate standards proficiencies independent on each grading period. So if I have 4 quarters that I'm working with, let's say it's a year-long class and I have 4 quarters, when quarter 1 has ended and I start assessing scores in quarter 2, my standards are going to kind of start fresh. So I might use the same standard in quarter 1 as I did in quarter 2, but none of the grades that the students had in quarter 1 are going to affect quarter 2 moving forward. My other option is to calculate all assignments and standards for the current school year. So that's going to look at the term of the class, and it's going to move standards forward into each grading period. So if I assess a standard in marking period 1, it's going to then be calculated automatically in marking period 2 once marking period 2 starts, and then anything that you add to that standard is going to be calculated along with what was given in marking period 1. So it's kind of a cumulative way of grading, but there's just a couple rules down here that go along with that cumulative grading so that we don't have assignments counting in multiple places. But again, we can talk about those if you are transitioning to standards-based grading. The last one I'll mention, we have an idea of autofilling standard scores from assignment scores. It's not really a recommended setting. It's I believe it was a customization from a client that needed to fill in some standard scores from the assignment score. Not recommended because it's not true standards-based grading. Like if you give a student 17 out of 20, it might give the student a 3 on the standard. But if there's multiple standards involved, it would give the student a 3 on every standard, and that's not really true standards-based grading. We want to be able to assess those standards individually. So it's just kind of a default in my environment, so I wanted to show that one. Okay. Next step that a teacher might take to get ready for standards-based grading, and you might have seen standards in my gradebook already, and that's fine. But a next step that a teacher might take is to come in here to a screen called Class Standards. We had talked about this in my May webinar for administrators, but the Class Standards screen is something really that the teachers use to either prepare their grade books for standards-based grading or to pull in what a district says they should be teaching for their course that they're focused to. So this screen does a couple different things. So you can see that I have standards listed here on this screen. These could be standards that I've already assessed in my grade book. So if I assess 10 standards from scratch, I'm going to have 10 standards listed here. That's pretty straightforward. The other piece that it does is I have this load standards from course alignment. So if my district says course American History during whatever that course is, they say that that course should address these 10 standards. The district can put those standards on the course, and the teacher comes in here, and all they do is click one link here, and it's going to pull all those standards in for their course, which is pretty great. Saves a lot of work for the teachers, but it is a little bit more work on the district side, but I think it's totally worth it, because when you start letting the more teachers or the more people you have trying to follow your instructions, you know, the less that it gets done. So if you can get it ready at the district level, that's going to be fantastic. The other piece is add from district standards bank. So if I'm a history teacher here, I could come into the whole bank of standards and say, all right, I know that I teach history. I want to be sure that I teach this standard 4408 or 4420 or whatever these standards are. I can pre-populate my class standards screen with those standards. So I have them down here at the bottom. So I know what I want to teach this year. I pre-populate my gradebook with that. There's some things here. If the aggregation method is not locked at the district level, if the weight is unlocked, it's kind of a database thing, but if the weight isn't locked, if I have some config values that let my teachers change some settings, I can also use this screen and update this. So if I didn't want to score this or have this standard calculated with power law, I could come in and edit the row and just set it to mean, and that's going to recalculate my gradebook, and that standard is going to get calculated differently if you let your teachers change settings on these screens. All right, the last thing that this screen allows you to do in class standards is to come into my objectives here. And I'm not going to create any right now, but my objective standards are teacher-created custom standards that the teacher wants to assess. It could be another academic standard that is not part of the system. It could be a behavior standard, like the student comes to class prepared, and the teacher wants to score that. So this is where the teacher does that. Once they choose all the settings for the standard, they then apply it to their classes. So if they only want to use it in 3 of their classes, they can mark that. And then when they go create assignments or edit assignments, they can choose that standard. All right, so now let's look at what it looks like as a teacher to create assignments and to attach them to standards. So normally they're going to be in assignment view here. The teachers are going to be in assignments view. They come in to create a new assignment or edit an assignment. It really does the same thing. And I'm going to go ahead and create my assignment here. So I'm going to choose everything that I would normally choose. Couple things to point out. We have a score type that your teachers normally pick, most likely like raw score, maybe percentage, maybe a rubric style. It actually doesn't matter what they pick here because the standards themselves have a score type associated with them. So you saw before that my standards are tied with like a standards 4 or a 4-point rubric that I'm going to be grading with. And that doesn't matter what I pick as a teacher. So I might, as a teacher, say that this quiz or something, this homework assignment, doesn't matter, has 25 questions on it, that's fine. I want it to be worth 10 points in my gradebook. That is all just fine. It has nothing to do with my standards and how those are scored. So we'll show you what that looks like. I come down to the standards correlations tab. And if you have this hidden in pad security, this is why your teachers might not see it, but this is standards correlations. And the nice thing when they first come down here is going to be it defaults to that class standard. So if I've pre-populated that screen with the standards that I want to use, or if the district pre-populated the course and I pulled in those course standards, it's going to populate to that tab or that, this view here, so that teachers don't really have to go guessing and picking and choosing what standards that they want to assess. So class standards is really an organized list for them. So these are all the standards that I've either used or want to use. I get a little recent standard list, so the last 4 standards that I've chosen will appear here by code, or I can just come down and choose whatever I want. So I'm going to go ahead and pick one that I've used before, 1P01. I'll choose another standard, and I can really just choose as many standards as I want in time to my assignment. As I choose standards, it shows up in this little assignment standards area and shows me the standards that I have tied to my standard, and just a visual piece there. Okay. So I will go ahead and save that. Okay, so I've got my assignment in my gradebook, and now we can talk about how we enter scores. So there's a couple ways that we can enter scores. This view that we have here is my assignments view. So you remember I created my assignment out of 25, so I could still grade it out of 25, whatever the students have here, and you're going to see my students' grades did not change because my overall grade isn't coming from assignments. So I can use this as just teacher data that I want to keep track of this for my own reason. But a lot of full standards-based districts don't use assignments view at all. They'll expect that to be completely blank in this view, and that's fine. So one way of entering standard scores, I think this is the easiest way to get started with it. So if you're new to standards-based grading, it's nice to click on the assignment and go to enter scores. What that's going to do is open the enter score screen, and this column here is my assignment that I just saw. I don't have to have values here, but then I can expand my assignment and see the standards underneath it. So on interpret historical data, maybe Andrew here earned a 3, and on author's main points, he earned a 2. And William, maybe he's really great at everything, and Donald is struggling in some areas. So the teacher can come in and kind of choose that from the rubric dropdown. And see, it really has no bearing on that overall grade on the assignment. So they're unrelated ideas. The teacher can fill down. There's a setting, if you're not aware of it, that if it's hard for your teachers to choose things from drop-downs, we can make these text fields. So any rubric score type, we can make them text fields so that they can use that 10 key on their keyboard and enter scores really quickly if this is hindering them. All right, so I'll go ahead and save that and go back to Gradebook. And so that's one way of entering scores, and I'll show you where those show up in Gradebook. So I need to toggle over to my standards view here, and this is going to be the other way of entering scores, but I'll show you what that did. One of the standards that I assessed is going to be author's main points. This is my webinar standards test assignment that I just created. So when I come into standards view, I have all of my standards in blue here, and I can expand them to see the assignments underneath it. So author's main points, that's going to be the standard that's been assessed twice now in my class. Webinar standards test, I can come in here and give the student a 3, and that 3 counts towards that standard in addition to the 3 that's already here. And those are going to combine mathematically using that aggregation method. I have power law set, so it doesn't calculate quite yet. And that's going to be the second way of entering scores. So I come in, I expand my standard, and choose the assignment column, enter the score, and it's going to apply towards my standard. Okay, that's really it on entering scores. I can do it from the enter score screen, or I can do it from Gradebook main. The next piece that we'll look at is analyzing the data that is in here. So if this is unfamiliar to you, obviously you want to maybe set up some standards in a test environment, and I can walk you through how to do that. But this lets me get a nice view of how my students are doing in these different areas, and I can expand. I do have colors going on right now, so hopefully that's not too distracting. Okay, so now let's analyze our data. The first piece in analyzing data is going to be what we call levels. So if we look at my levels drop down here, my standards toggle, you're going to see a lot of different levels here that go along with my standards. So this falls back into the synergy side in standards where we have some structure that goes with the standards that, I might have something like a strand, concept, objective, level 4. These aren't words that I made up, but they could be if I wanted them to. If you use cluster, domain, strand, thread, all that, those are custom levels. So one piece of analysis that I have is moving up to different levels. So I have these social studies level 4 standards, this PO7C, PO5D, etc. If I come up to the objective level, I'm going to see some standards here, 3 more individual standards, and then you see these are highlighted in blue. We'll talk about that in a minute, but that means that it has some children's standards tied to it, so that A and B, they kind of combine into this, so we'll look at that. And then if I go further into concept, I have one concept that's been addressed so far in my gradebook called Research Skills for History, and then if I go up to the strand level, I'm going to have a major standard called American History. So that's kind of a very broad standard here. So I can zoom through my levels here and analyze my data that way. Once I'm up to a level that I like to look at, I can click on the code of the standard. These aren't very useful codes. It just has a 1 here. But you can see it's like a blue hyperlink. So if I choose that code, it's going to show me all of the substandards that that calculate this 3, but that's underneath American history. So I'll go ahead and pick it. So underneath American history, the American history proficiency is coming from Research Skills for History, and I can keep going. Where is this 3 coming from? Well, I can click 1.1 and say, oh, it's coming from these 5 standards. Fine. Where's 1.1.PO5 coming from? I can click that one and go down even further and said, okay, that one is coming from these 3 individual standards. So that's going to be my leveling system, and it just happens to be like some codes in here that aren't super useful. But these 3 standards make up PO5. The one from PO5 moves up to 1.1, etc. So I can analyze my student data by using leveling system here. All right. My next piece that I can use to analyze data, I'm going to go into the objective level just because I have some nicer data here, is under the standards toggle, I have an option to show summary score, and I'll show you what that looks like. You're going to see everything goes from kind of a whole number to a decimal value, and this is going to be what is actually calculated down further, like in the database, so what we're actually looking at here. When I have summary score off, this is my score type, my 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the only grades that I can enter are 1, 2, 3, 4, which is why it just shows a 1, 2, 3, 4. But what is actually getting calculated, this first student, for example, they're really at a 3.59 for this standard, and that's going to be a power law score, so it combines the 2 and the 4 and the 3, and power law says that if the student was assessed today, how would they be doing on the standard? And we're saying that it's a 3.59. So you're going to see a lot of different variants here. If you use something like highest score, lowest score, those are still going to be whole numbers because all you have to deal with is whole numbers, but something like an average might calculate a decimal. Power law often does, as long as you have those 3 results here. I think we talked about that last webinar. That's going to be summary score. So we can see how close a student is to maybe a next proficiency. So they're really close to a 3, even though gradebook main might show a 2 when summary score is off. The other thing under here is going to be a standards evidence chart. I'll go ahead and turn that on. What that does is it lets me come into gradebook main, and I might have all of these standards here, and instead of having to expand all of my standards and seeing my assignments underneath, I can simply click the field, and that's going to show me that I've assessed the standard 1, 2, 3 times. The student started out pretty bad at a 2, jumped to a 4, and then down to a 3. So we can see the historical data of a standard that a student, how a student's performed on that standard. So that's what that does. That's what that standards evidence chart does. I can choose to hide that score in Portal. I can fill down if I want, but that's not often used, especially with standards data, but it is there available. All right. Next for analysis is going to be some reports. So the first one that I want to point out, under Gradebook, most of you have enabled progress reports. So I'm going to go into student progress reports here. And I should be able to run them live. Hopefully my other computer is working for me. But if not, I have an example here. We have lots of different ways that standards can show on progress reports. The most obvious one is when you run it by standard. It looks at all of the standards that are assessed in your class. And if I hide that really quick, these are going to be the standards that are assessed in my class, the ones that have assignments tied to them. And it's going to show me that standards data, which is great. I can choose to show assignment details, so I can see every assignment underneath each standard, and it shows me how I've performed on there. I think it's great data, but if you have a lot of standards in your class and a lot of assignments tied to a lot of standards, the progress report just gets really long, but that might not be a problem, especially if you're like emailing it versus printing it. So those options are there for you. My other options are to run it by section. And when I run it by section, that's going to give me, let me refresh this one real quick. This is the part I hope it works on my other computer. Okay, when I run it by section, this gives me an assignment view of my gradebook. So these are my assignments in class, which is pretty standard. I can then choose to show standards detail. So I might have my assignments here up at the top that hasn't changed, and then down below I see my standards here. I do have them listed more than once because they're assessed more than once, which is why it looks like it's duplicated data, but it's really not. This is just the assignments view of a progress report. I can do it by class summary as well. I won't run that one right now, but the class summary will pull data from all of my students' classes, and then I can choose to show standards detail from there as well. So that's going to be progress reports. A new feature in version 2020 is going to be a new report that we added. And we have a couple new standards reports coming in the future. Version 2020-01, I know for sure has some in there. But for now, in version 2020, we have a new report called Class Standards. It's going to be the default in the list when you first come here. This only shows in the drop-down if you have standards mode enabled on the class. So if you're a traditional based grading school, you won't see that option for your teachers because it doesn't pertain to them. So class standards. These other reports in here, they're not for standards-based teachers anyway. Some might use them, some might not, but this is really great for teachers. You have a couple options to choose here, but I won't need to. I'll just point them out as I run it. I should be able to run it just fine. And if not, I think I have it in my PowerPoint. All right, so this is a new report that lets us look at standards data. If I have an analysis band on my class, which I do, that's the colorful parts, I'm going to show that analysis band, and I'm going to give a breakdown on this report of how my students are performing by analysis band. So I can see that this first standard, I've assessed it twice so far. My class average is 3.25, and I have, I guess, only 4 students with results on that standard, 2 of which are earning a 4, and then you can see the results from there. So that's going to be the first part of the report, is giving a breakdown of the standards along with the analysis band. If I don't have an analysis band set on the class, that area just doesn't show, and the evidence and average is how the graph ends, the chart ends. If I go a little bit further down, I'm going to see basically my gradebook main view just on a report, so I can see the standards that were assessed in class by code, and these are going to be the standards that are tied to assignments, and then I'm going to see the analysis band breakdown. So the colors that appear here should match the colors that appear here. I have some different results in here because of it only pulls standards that assignments are tied to, so these black ones here, not the blue ones. But that's going to be new there. If you don't have an analysis band on, it's going to highlight any students who are falling just below the class average. So it'll look at the average here and say if a student is below the class average, it's going to highlight them for you there so that you know what students are kind of doing a little bit worse than other students. So that's a brand new standards report. I know we've been waiting for some reports to come through, and they are coming through now. The very last piece that I have is what it looks like in parent view and student view. And so there's some options within parent view, student view configuration. We talked about those in my last webinar. But I'm going to come into my seating chart so that I can get to student view. I'm going to open up my student. I know who has results. Andrew Labamba. If I come into Gradebook, I'm going to see my classes here. I've got my American History class. And what I get here, and this is an option on the district side, I have my assignments view, which is normal, my standard traditional based grading, but then I have an option of showing standards detail. So that's an option on the Synergy admin side if I want to show standards detail in Parent View Student View. I can also default my Parent View Student View to open to Standards View automatically. So if your teachers only grade by standard and you want to open that by default for your parents or students, you can do that. But when I come in here, I'm going to get the same kind of view that I had on the progress report and in Gradebook Main. These are going to be the standards that have assignments tied to them. So these are not my parent standards, not my domain, my clusters, my threads, whatever. These are only the standards that have assignments tied to them. We're working in the future on having Parent View, Student View show the different levels, but it's not there yet. Parents and students can come in, they can see their standards, and they can see that they've earned a 2 out of 4 on this. We can show this graph. You can hide this if you want. That's another Parent View configuration. And I simply click on the standard itself, and it shows me the 2 different assignments within it and shows me how I performed. So I earned a 3 and a 2, and that's actually giving me a 2. This is the one that has a Power Law result, so I've earned a 2, a 3, and a 4, and Power Law says that I'm going to have a 3.59. I can choose to show that as a decimal. I can choose to show these as decimals, and that's going to be a config value to do that. And that is going to be it for today. So that's going to be standards-based grading as a teacher, and what it looks like, analyzing some data, and then as a student. So if you're interested, I can take any questions right now. You just need to put up your hand in the interface of the GoToWebinar, and I can unmute your line. Okay, it doesn't look like I have any questions that have come through. If you do have any questions, please feel free to call me on the support line. We'll flip back to the PowerPoint real quick. Okay, if I have no more questions, which it doesn't look like I have any, our next webinar is going to be on August 22nd, so the 4th Thursday of the month. Thanks, everybody.